Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to go into the second round. And I wanted to follow up on the theme that Mr. Golden was speaking about with Mr. Clark's response about the smaller ships. But I wanted to switch over to Mr. O'Rourke, because I know in reading your testimony, you commented on this, and I think I'm quoting you. It may have been one of the other testimonies. The FFG is 1/3 of the firepower, but 2/3 of the cost. And I saw that you had made some suggestions as to ways to build more platforms at the lower end. So if we're talking large surface combatant, small, we really want to talk small, and some of the ideas and specifically coordination with the Coast Guard and how we could leverage off of the designs that they've already implemented as naval forces. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, the quote that you had is from Brian Clark's testimony, but the general point is that the frigate that we have in the FSGX is a 7,000-ton ship. And I'll say just very quickly, in answer to the earlier question about lessons learned from the LCS. The LCS was a new hull design and some new equipment. The frigate is working off a parent design, and it's not to have any new development items on it. So in terms of managing its technical risk, we seem to have learned a lot of lessons from the LCS. Now, as a frigate, it is a fairly large frigate by world standards. It's in the 7,000-ton range. And in my testimony, I talk about that creating room or opportunity to consider smaller ships underneath it, something perhaps in the manner of a 5,000-ton ship, which would be a smaller frigate, or something in the 1 to 4,000-ton range, which would be a corvette of the kind that Brian Clark talked about. There are many possible ship designs out there for doing that, including designs that have come out of the Coast Guard's cutter procurement program, including the National Security Cutter and the designs that have been developed for the Offshore Patrol Cutter. That creates a once-in-a-generation opportunity to think about commonalities that work across the services to get greater production economies of scale so that you could work more toward the goal of optimizing our national shipbuilding effort as opposed to sub-optimizing our shipbuilding effort at the individual service level.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Clark, I wanted to go back to some comments in the 2017 CSBA Restoring American Seapower study. I noted in there that you talked about the model that you were using with geographic combatant commanders and shifting that to a deterrence and maneuver model. And although we say we have global force management to source our forces around the world, often that creates geographic stovepiping of resources. And there is sharing, and the combatant commanders do work together. But can you describe your model and specifically in the terms of how you think that could help us gain more efficiency in providing presence?
Yeah, so the model we moved to is similar to what was adopted in the National Defense Strategy after that. So the model where you have forces that are focused on local operations overseas in different theaters. So there's a deterrence force for the East China Sea, and there's one for the South China Sea, and there's one for the Persian Gulf.
And it seemed sorry to interrupt, but that you had a lot of forward basing of these forces.
Right, and those forces would predominantly be forward based, where they would be able to get used to the neighborhood, learn the allies, learn the potential adversaries, understand the geography. So we saw there being a lot of value in that model, which has been very beneficial for our forward deployed naval force that's in Japan, where those forces gain that level of familiarity. And it also allows them to pursue this higher operational tempo or this shorter operational cycle because they don't need to relearn everything every time they go on deployment because they know where they're going and they know the people they're likely to deal with. So those deterrence forces were then augmented or complemented by a blunt force, which is the carrier strike groups that would be deploying out of the continental United States, that would be going on these longer deployments, that would be operating on a slower, more like the OFRP operational cycle. We saw it be really important to look at the divergence between two different operational cycles because we saw it being necessary to maintain presence overseas, to get a higher operational tempo out of some of our forces. And we saw the way to do that as giving them this limited responsibility as a deterrence force where they didn't have to go through as long a training cycle for each deployment. And because they would be remote and located near the areas where they were going to deploy, the transit time would be shorter, and so they could maintain a higher operational tempo and therefore a greater presence. So that model was incorporated to some degree into the NDS in the form of the blunt force that the blunt and contact forces that the National Defense Strategy discusses. The contact force is like our deterrence force, largely forward deployed, operating in concert with our allies and dealing with adversaries. And then the blunt force was this larger force that remained offshore and operated from CONUS for the most part.
If I could just add to that, I think the concept works well, but it also requires political flexibility because building ships and having them forward where they're not being maintained in the continental United States, where the economies aren't benefiting from the crews, that's political reality. And if we want to be able to be more flexible, if we want to be able to have these forward forces, that's something that I think needs to be addressed.
Well, thank you, Admiral. And I just want to close by quoting something that Mr. Clark just said in his testimony when answering a previous question. I'm quoting you that you said the resulting lack of a product or response from the Pentagon was based off of internal dynamics of leadership changes. And I think that we are caught up in exactly that churn right now because we don't have a 30-year shipbuilding plan. We don't have a force structure assessment. And the Navy has needs. We're here to meet those needs. But if you can't tell us what they are because of the internal dynamics of leadership changes that continue to happen, it puts us in a difficult situation. And I think it puts the sailor on the deck plate in a difficult situation because I truly feel that there's not a consistent vision. And even when we have had a 30-year shipbuilding plan, when it changes every year in years 1 through 5, that is still not a clear vision. So I appreciate your work. I appreciate the thought and insight you put into how we can develop our future Navy. And I look forward to hearing from the Navy what they truly want to request to meet their mission. So thank you again.
Thank you. Well put, Elaine.